Today's discussion is designated to the latest developments of the last 2 years for the Ukraine-Canada relations. And I'm glad to present the three speakers for today. Yegor Valerianenko, who is the expert of the Global Outreach Program at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism, and who is the author of the newly published report on Ukraine-Canada relations that you will be able to check at our website. Then Dr. Volkan Davlin from the MacDonald Louvier Institute in Ottawa, and Dr. Alexander Lanoshka from the Waterloo University, also Canada. And I also hope that Dr. Volodymyr Dubovik from Odessa National University will join us as the discutant, considering his vast experience.
Yes, hello, but I'll have to leave in 20-something minutes, sorry. Yeah.
Wonderful. We will go with this recording and we'll hope to have this discussion. So let me start from Yegor to present the main outcomes of the report that we had within the Ukrainian Prism, and what are the main conclusions we could have analyzing the last 2 years and how the relations changed.
Yeah, thank you, Hanna. Thank you very much. And basically, one of the main things that we'd like to highlight with our research and with our work is that, among a dozen strategic partners formally listed in Ukraine's strategic documents, Canada is among the ones where this status is more or less justified, both practically and in terms of the legal framework. And if we follow the questions that we have planned for this discussion, one of the first and easy answers to the first one of whether Ukraine and Canada could overcome all the difficulties faced by them both internally and externally would be yes, because these relations have gradually developed over decades of changing governments and different external circumstances. Even with the current stage, which started in 2014, it went through one government change in both countries, and still they continued building up their relations, developing bilateral legal and practical framework of cooperation, encompassing a range of different areas, both the military, the economy, and all other spheres of their relations. And in this regard, Canada has been one of the stronger supporters of Ukraine, both from the 2014, from the occupation of Crimea and the start of hostilities in the Donbass, and of course from 2022, when Canada became at the forefront of the Ukrainian support and assistance, which has been conducted ever since by the Western countries and their allies. And of course, that would be a very easy and simple answer, and the world we live in is not that easy and simple. And there are, of course, some downsides to this. And basically, it depends on the level of evaluation and the framework of this evaluation that we use in our analysis. And here, many could argue that the Ukrainian-Canadian relations are following some kind of predetermined path that is happening just automatically, and thus they are losing an opportunity to achieve the full potential of these relations. And in this regard, there are several key points here that I'd like to highlight. And the first one is regarding the Ukrainian side of these relations. And the matter with this is that sometimes in Ukraine, especially after the start of the full-scale invasion, which turned a lot of things upside down here and made a lot of different things and decisions emotional and focused on the strategic goal of overcoming Russian aggression, but at the same time, it made the Ukrainian decision makers, and which is reflected in the policies that Ukraine has been implementing some kind of reprioritization of foreign policy. And in this regard, Canada is sometimes viewed as just indispensable part of the West, which supports Ukraine, while some individual specifics and specific characteristics and nature of Ukrainian-Canadian relations might be disregarded, or at least omitted, just due to the nature of the assignments that stand before the Ukrainian foreign policy right now. So we could say that some of these opportunities are being missed out just because the Ukrainian approach lacks some individual steps toward Ottawa in particular. And if we talk about the Canadian side, there are always many things that could be criticized in terms of Western support of Ukraine. And there are two key points that I'd like to highlight here about Canada. The first one being that in general, there is, so to say, underestimation and lack of accepted acknowledgement of the existing threats from the Russian side, both directly in terms of economic sphere and security, for instance, in the Arctic, and indirectly because of some more profound questioning of the existing rules underlying the world order by such actors as Russia and its partners and allies. And well, here the second point is that, which is partly resulting from the first one, is that Canada is often dependent on close coordination with its allies, namely the US and the EU, and it's like in its own individual initiative when it comes to the support of Ukraine, which we have sometimes seen previously. And here I do not by any means want to create an ungrateful or neglected impression, because Canada, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the speech, has been at the forefront of international assistance to Ukraine, being among the first ones to grant Ukraine the M777 artillery systems, Leopard tanks, actively promoted and participated in various capability coalitions, even with the limited military and economic resources that it has, let alone other military, humanitarian, and political initiatives. So that is something that we have been trying to acknowledge and promote, including during our work under this project, and that's actually something that the research that Hannah mentioned is focused on highlighting how Canada has assisted us. But at the same time, while being at the forefront of international assistance, Ottawa was there mostly with the achieved consensus of its allies. And another example here was even such a unique initiative at the time in 2022, not relevant to military assistance as confiscation of Russian assets in favor of assistance to Ukraine. And that is also one of the matters we researched, and it's really interesting that Canada was one of the first countries that made respective amendments in its legislation that allowed confiscation of Russian assets in favor of Ukraine, but at the same time with such a revolutionary approach, most of the discussions, let alone practical implementations of these initiatives, have been, with some minor exceptions, delayed until the wider collaborations among G7 countries, the EU, the United States, which took place already this year. And so while there is an understanding of these points among the expert community and part of the military and political leadership of both countries, spreading the same understanding among the wider population and consequently incorporating it in respective strategies as well as their implementation on the ground, both on the Canadian and the Ukrainian side, especially against the backdrop of political turbulence in the US and Europe, will pose a serious challenge to deal with. And just to wrap up this input with Canada approach in its next electoral cycle next year, where Liberal Party led by Justin Trudeau is looking at so to say, not the best chances, with a decent chance of the Conservative Party overtaking the government. I would not say that from our perspective, there is a substantial concern about the overall direction of Canadian policy toward assisting Ukraine in military, humanitarian spheres and supporting it politically on the international arena. But at the same time, if we take a step back and take a look at, so to say, a larger picture, well, there is a lot of space where these relations could be further improved and taken to a new level if Ukraine, on the one hand, will acknowledge and highlight the importance for itself of Canada in its foreign and security policies, and if Canada acknowledges the urgency and the challenge posed by the Russian actions for it. And of course, if both sides make relevant adjustments in their own approaches, this would be the first steps to fully realize and implement the available potential that we are talking about. And here I would be really grateful to hear your opinions on this, my initial input, and further elaborations on the topics that we have for today. So thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Volkan, I will refer now to you with the view from another side of the Atlantic, from Ottawa. How much the Canadian government been ready in 2022 to the necessity to change or to activate their policy towards Ukraine? And were they ready to the threats that they need to face and to be, let's say, more up to speed of the changes in the transatlantic relations and in the Ukrainian-Canadian relations needed at that time?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Anna. I will be a little bit more critical than Yehor. In the sense that I think two things are important to highlight here. Number one, as the name of this particular panel suggests, this is about wartime partnership. This is not just business as usual. We'll take our time in the bureaucratic structures and quibble over this and that and take our time. This is wartime, and wartime requires much faster decision-making cycles and a sense of urgency, which unfortunately seems to be lacking. So that's number one. I'm not sure, and I don't think that there is, when it comes to military assistance, Canada is or has that sense of urgency or a recognition that this is, you cannot pursue objectives in wartime with peacetime means and peacetime processes and the mindset. When it comes to the humanitarian aspect of it, that's a different story, which I'm not going to sort of get into details here, including special visas for Ukrainians who are leaving the country, enabling the process, international law dimension of holding Russian leaders to account for the war crimes. That's going to be a very slow process, but it is important, and people like Alexander Matvichuk and others are creating the necessary evidence and working on collecting the evidence and creating the necessary infrastructure. And Canada is playing a role and will continue to play a role. And there is just this today and yesterday, I think, the humanitarian dimension of Zelensky's victory plan is being discussed in Montreal, etc. So there is a long-term contribution there where Canada has experience when it comes to international law and persecution of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that is a very important step, and that has to be done. But that does not mean that the immediate issue of winning the war should be left to others, and there I think Canada can and should do more. And I will highlight two problems with it, without, I'll be happy to go into detail in terms of the details of it. But number one is, as I said, the lack of urgency here in Ottawa, and the mindset that war and bad things happen to other people in faraway places. That mindset, unfortunately, is still, particularly within the political class, and the bureaucrats taking their, of course, cues naturally from their political masters, do not seem to understand that what we are facing is not the first sort of a limited regional conflict in Europe, where we have limited equities, but it is the front line in terms of the defending both the basics of the international order, but also Canadian interests at this stage. So I think the conceptualization, and this is something we have been seeing, and Alexander, I've been highlighting this again and again and again, is that supporting Ukraine is not charity, but it is self-interest for Canada. And I think if I may make one sort of criticism on the Ukrainian side, is that framing it as gratefulness is not helping, because it lets people off the hook of that this is also the pursuit of Canadian national interest. This is not giving alms or being charitable to others, but this is about protecting Canadian interests. Because if we don't want to pay pennies today, we will end up paying hundreds of dollars in the future, and we'll probably also pay the ultimate price as Ukrainians are doing in terms of blood as well. So number one is that there is a lack of sense of urgency here in Ottawa. Two very quick examples, and these are parts of a larger pattern. Number one is that Canada still did not issue additional contracts for ammunition production from 155 military shells since October 2022. We're still asking only the peacetime replacement of the stocks, etc., right? There's nothing coming through. We're getting into it's going to be the third year in a few months. This is not acceptable, right? This is not a mindset that requires the DND, our Department of National Defense, announced that they are funding a study back in April to see whether ramping up the 155 artillery shells are warranted. This is just not an acceptable way of thinking. The other example is what Canada promised as refurbished light armored vehicles that were supposed to be delivered to Ukraine 9 months ago, 10 months ago. But now they're squibbling over within bureaucracy whether the particular costs that the company who's doing the refurbishing is acceptable or not. So it got stuck, right? They're not being done and they're not being delivered. These are not theoretical issues. This may sound theoretical to people here in Ottawa, and quibbling over, does it going to cost 15 cents for this particular bolt, or is it 20 cents? And how are we going to negotiate? It is a very real issue in terms of the people in the front lines. Because of the lack of armored vehicles, things such as moving in armored personal vehicles and other things, it increases casualty rates. It leads more people to die. It makes it harder for the wounded to be evacuated from the front. So it actually literally costs lives every time and every day we delay delivering these things. And again, debating about 5 million here or 6 million there is missing the point. This is not peacetime. We're talking about a wartime, and if we are going to make a commitment in terms of wartime, we would need to make it, right? So those are the two basic examples. Now there are other things that I think Canada do well, and I think we should be able to do better. I think one of the sort of important success stories that have been sort of brought up and would need to be brought up again and again is the Operation Unifier that Canada significantly contributed to the training. And I think if we want to take a step, and I'll be happy to come back to that at the maybe in the second round, is that we should be able to make the case that we can continue get in Ukraine and do the training in Ukraine, not in Poland, not in UK, and elsewhere else, right? That would show leadership. It will create a meaningful action, together with the fact that that was a very successful program. And lastly, and this is what I'm going to stop and get my rant over, is the confiscation of Russian assets. Now, the law that was passed, I don't know whether because of it's not paying attention to it or didn't really think through it, was actually about not seizing the sovereign assets, but about the individuals. And there was an amendment that is still waiting in Canadian Senate that amends that particular law that would enable Canada to confiscate Russian sovereign assets. And as our friend and colleague Erin Gash-Burnett, a Canadian German based in Berlin journalist, have brought for Macdonald-Laurier Institute several times. There are 9% of Canadian central bank Russian central bank assets held in Euroclear in Brussels are held in Canadian dollars. That is roughly $19 billion Canadian dollars worth of Russian central bank assets that Canada can seize and confiscate, not freeze, if we pass this law and want to be leading in this one. It will cost the Canadian taxpayer nothing, and it will show true leadership. But as Yehor pointed out, Canada has been very risk averse and would prefer not to be the first mover in this. And this is an area in which we can do it. We may not be able to produce ammunition as fast as we want, or get the air defense systems because we don't have them and we're waiting Americans to produce and so that we can send it. But we can do this, and it will make a significant difference. $19 billion is not little money. It can be used for military purposes. It can be transferred right over there. So there is, yes, Canada is doing things especially on the humanitarian side and international law component, but on the war fighting component and enabling Ukraine's victory on the battlefield, I think we should not be get off the hook as easily as it is. There are things that Canada can take the lead on and should do it, but the lack of the sense of urgency is a big problem. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Volkan. Alexander, let me turn to you and ask a little bit more complicated question, because we're always comparing, and we can say about the one country that we would like more, but we understand that the countries themselves are also comparing what their partners, what their allies are doing, and considering these as saying, are we doing enough or not, except of those who are going to be just leaders and not look beyond them. Just last year, we've analyzed with you UK-British relations, for example. You also know about a few other countries. If you compare with those, where Canada is, can we say that de facto Canada, yes, could do better, but is in line with the partners and just don't want to do something beyond the US policy or the UK policy or the NATO policy? Or it is still something that Canada can do that other partners are already doing, and it is just the political will, let's say, that is not allowing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this very important issue. And I agree with everything that Volkan had said. Perhaps I've maybe talk a little bit more about the more positive things that we're doing. But nevertheless, it is a great question, precisely because I think the trends that we've observed show that Canada has shifted where it is vis-a-vis other allies as regards to Ukraine. If we go back to 2014, I think Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, was actually one of the first NATO leaders to go to Kyiv. In fact, he was there before any major American dignitary had gone, and seemed like Canada was much more actively involved on Ukraine than the Americans were in the spring of 2014. And indeed, if you look at weapons shipments of any sort of variety to Ukraine between 2014 and let's say 2018, Canada was one of the few countries that actually did provide meaningful military assistance. Volkan had mentioned Operation Unifier, and I don't think it necessarily trained as many troops as Operation Orbital, but it was very much a significant development that I think ultimately contributed to Ukraine's tactical successes in some form in 2022, when again, the Americans were rather reluctant and were slow to get into the ground, at least with respect to their eventual training operations in Western Ukraine. That being said, I think over time, Canada has fallen back behind some allies. So even over the course of the late 2010s, Canada pulled back some of its assistance. It didn't give some of the satellite imagery of high definition that it did early on, in part because of cost. At least that was what the Trudeau government had said at the time. Canada did not really offer much in the way of lethal military aid. Indeed, in February 2022, when it became very apparent that the Russian military buildup was combat credible and would mean some significant military operation, the announced military assistance was largely non-lethal in character. That was not exactly in step with what those allies were doing along the eastern flank at that time. There was also a bit of a discrepancy between some of the rhetoric that we saw from Ottawa and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the actual assistance that we're providing. I recall Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland announced this aid package to Ukraine in February 2022, before, of course, Russia launched the full-scale invasion, arguing that this was essential for Ukraine's fight against autocracy and that their fight was our fight. But again, if you look at the details of the actual military package, it didn't seem like it was commensurate to that level of stakes involved. But after the full-scale invasion, Canada was indeed a leader once more, especially as regards to humanitarian assistance. Canada is a rich G7 country. We don't necessarily act rich all the time. We tend to pinch a lot of pennies, but we do have deep pockets, and we were willing to use them, and we have been using them. We do have a fairly strong reservoir of international legal expertise that, as Balkan mentioned, has been useful for contributing to Ukrainian efforts to litigate Russian war crimes. Now, we have been leaders in terms of providing some forms of military assistance, especially in 2022. But again, for the reasons that Balkan had mentioned, we have slid back. Not to say that this is a competition, but we just are not doing as much as we have. We did give those M777s that you have mentioned. And by the way, thank you very much for that final report and its summary. But we have done nothing to, in fact, fill in those stockpiles. We have given ammunition to Ukraine, but as Balkan mentioned, our efforts to increase ammunition production has been very limited. I think we went from maybe 3,000 rounds per month to about 6 or so. Balkan, you can correct me, but I don't believe it's higher than 7 or 8. And for the ammunition production capacity to increase to where it ought to be, that would cost the Canadian government an estimated $400 to $600 million Canadian. That sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, to be sure. But then when you put other government investments in perspective, most notably, dare I say, subsidies to Stellantis, Volkswagen, and Honda, that number actually pales in comparison to the $25 billion given to those particular companies. So unfortunately, I would say that relative to other NATO countries, Canada has fallen behind. It talks a nice talk, but it hasn't really prepared itself for any sort of meaningful effort to help Ukraine win. The rhetoric is the same. We're with Ukraine for as long as it takes, which is, I think, brutal and unhelpful, because that's not the point of war. It's trying to win as much as you can, as quickly as you can. But that's just not been the approach. And although there have been announcements regarding increased ammunition production and greater efforts to support Ukraine, those come after 2025. And that will be a new government almost certainly. And so it will remain to be seen as to whether that government would actually table those items in any sort of budgetary announcement. So there's a lot that is contingent. And unfortunately, the Trudeau government has created a situation where we're kicking buckets down the road, and we're not necessarily doing as much as we can, precisely because those investments should have come in 2022 or even 2023 to yield any sort of positive return, 2025, 2026, and so forth.
Thank you very much, Igor. I will return back to you as we set the stage, where we are now, where we are after the 2 years. And at the same time, we understand that the war, unfortunately, would not finish this year. We are going to the next year. And we cannot define probably our bilateral relations only by the security supply or financial supply, but there should be something more that would stipulate also the Canadian government to be interested in supporting Ukraine, understanding what else can we get. So if I would ask you for the future, let's say, what is beyond the our current military support in the cooperation of between Ukraine and Canada, where we can develop relations, and where in what Ukraine will be particularly interested in?
Well, to begin it, we have to put it bluntly, unfortunately, that Ukraine is in a very difficult situation. And it is not getting any easier as the time goes on, because the hostilities are continuing, even if the Russians are moving just 1 centimeter after 1 centimeter, they are still moving. And currently we see that the situation is escalating globally with the Korean factor going in here. And in this regard, it is sometimes difficult to focus on bilateral relations between just Ukraine and Canada, because it goes way beyond that, and it is just something that we have to deal with on a greater scale. But if we talk particularly about the ways Canada and Ukraine could increase their cooperation, well, given that there is that acknowledgement of the need for this development that we have been talking about, that those factors that our colleagues have mentioned are at least minimized, if not overcome completely, which is, I think, would be very optimistic to hope that they will be overcome completely. There are, of course, a lot of different areas where this cooperation could be improved, and primarily we can talk about the overall political cooperation and promoting different pro-Ukrainian positions among the West, and Canada has been doing it quite successfully, but again with a rather limited scale, and this could be applied not only to the NATO and to the West in general, but also to cooperation with the so-called global South, because Canada does not have that kind of colonial past that, for instance, the United States and many European countries have in the eyes of many of the global South or non-Western countries. So in that regard, Canada could be making steps to promote to act as some kind of middle ground between Ukraine and those countries to spread and promote Ukrainian narratives and pro-Ukrainian policies, or at least just to provide an alternative opinion to the Russian narratives that are so prevalent in these countries. And in this regard, we also have, for instance, the information about the implementation of the Ukrainian peace formula, one of the following meetings on which is also greatly contributed by Ottawa. And well, in this regard, Canada has a lot of place where it could contribute to overall efforts in this direction. Besides, again, returning to the peace formula, Canada is one of the biggest energy suppliers, if we talk about fossil fuels and particularly oil, and also one of the biggest agricultural countries in the world. And that is where it could also employ its influence for promoting the energy and agricultural food security by, on the one hand, allowing for the stabilization of the global markets in these spheres, and on the other, by also applying pressure politically in different areas where it is possible. And of course, we cannot go without speaking about security and defense cooperation. And here, that topic, I would say, is kind of tricky, because again, as it was mentioned, Canada is not among the strongest military powers, and even in the West, and even compared to Ukraine, according to different international indexes, even before the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukrainian territory, Canada ranked lower than Ukraine, even before the influx of Western support and overall promotion of the development of Ukrainian armed forces. But in this regard, again, we can speak about Canada's influence both as a political actor and economic actor, member of the NATO, member of G7, where even from the experience, even limited one that we have had, sometimes even the lack of resources did not prevent Canada from supporting certain initiatives. So the first example that comes to mind here is the F-16 coalition, where Canada does not operate any F-16s, but still it is a member of the coalition, providing funding, providing personnel, and different assistance on the ground for the training missions for Ukrainian pilots. So again, these are the things that we acknowledge, but at the same time, as our colleagues here have also mentioned, these efforts have been rather limited. We can also speak about the overall cooperation between intelligence services, and also I think that the topic we should be talking more about is the exchange of experience, both politically and militarily, in terms of opposing Russian influence, which is quite pressing for Canada in the Arctic region, which has already been indicated in certain defense reviews and some strategic documents, and has been sounded by some representatives of Canadian political and military leadership. But at the same time, this is something that only the first steps or even half steps have been taken, and something that could be developed further on. And I think that's a topic where Ukrainian experience here could be helpful for Canada, and Canadian overall activization in this regard, and the subsequent political initiatives that could be following such kind of cooperation could also be beneficial for Ukraine in its opposition to Russian aggression.
Thank you, Balkan. As we are looking for the future, Canada is expecting elections next year. So what does it mean for bilateral Ukraine-Canada relations with the possible change of the ruling party? Will it mean the change of the policy or the approach just towards the Ukraine-Canada relations, or de facto we are having just the bipartisan support, and there can be changes in domestic policy, but in terms of the foreign and security policy, we will see the same. And because of these, can build the sustainable policy and relations that would not be changed in the next, let's say, 5 years.
Thanks, Anna. Let me just touch upon two things in terms of the future, and then get back to the domestic political aspect of it, which the bottom line would be, I think there is a broad consensus, despite the fact that there are voices in both the far right and the far left that are critical and skeptical of Canadian support for Ukraine. I think the broad base within Canada and the Canadians on both parties are very much in favor. So I do not necessarily see anti-Ukrainian coalition emerging, regardless of who wins the election. But before getting into that, I want to sort of highlight, if we're trying to get into more sort of practical things. One of my, and if I'm frustrated, I'm pretty sure you are 10 times more frustrated, is that we talk a lot, but we need to sort of need to move from talk to the action in terms of what very specifically can be done. And I want to sort of highlight maybe a couple things that moving forward in the future, Canada can actually make a difference. One is as you pointed out, the energy aspect of it, and not only oil and gas, but also the nuclear part of it, and Ukrainian nuclear power plants, and the system has been transitioning away from Rosatom to to others, and Canada in that sense is a major civilian nuclear power, not only because of the production of uranium, which I was told and read that is actually quite a high quality uranium that is being produced in northern Saskatchewan, but also the small modular reactors, as well as nuclear power plant technology, including Westinghouse, which is now a Canadian company. So I think there is in the medium to long term, important role Canada can play in rebuilding Ukrainian energy infrastructure while providing the necessary support for our allies in Europe in terms of reducing their dependence on Russian both nuclear as well as oil and gas. So there is, I think, a significant role Canada can play on that. And I agree with the agricultural component. Recently, I was reading that Canada is the third largest, this year became the third largest wheat exporter in the world. So there is the both food and fuel part of it where Canada can actually make a difference if it is politically used in a way to advance our interests. And it is also much more domestically sellable to the Canadian public as well. So I think there is a big role Canada should play and need to be being active in the rebuilding of particularly the energy infrastructure in Ukraine, but also more broadly in the region, in the what our Polish friends would call Intermaro, that the Three Seas Initiative, and the region. So it is a role Canada can actually very clearly play. The other part I want to sort of touch on very quickly is, again, as Alexander pointed out, we may not be doing much in terms of production over here, or the sort of the stocks to deliver, but we do have capabilities in terms of deeper pockets. And one of the things I think Canada should do, and we have been arguing for this, is to enable Canadian defense companies to engage in joint production in Ukraine, right? And as far as I'm aware, our Export Development Canada, which is sort of the Crown Corporation that provides support for Canadian businesses to build things, do investments, engage in exports, are not supporting or funding defense-related investments abroad. So there are things Canada can actually do by providing investment underwriting in Ukraine. Denmark is doing it. They recently announced what 700 million euros worth of defense investments in Ukraine. So those are can be done. And lastly, before getting into very briefly to the domestic political aspect, lastly, I think the two-way street of learning is extremely important, right? As Johor pointed out, there is a lot that Canada can learn. There's no one knows better than how to fight Russians than Ukraine is today. That is a very valuable skill and a knowledge set that us within NATO need to understand. Our troops in Latvia are there against the Russian threat. They're not there for hybrid whatever or cyber this and that. They are there for a physical threat that is emanating from the Russian Federation. And I think the two-way working both in terms of intelligence, but also in terms of the tactics, what works, etc., is going to be extremely valuable, and we need to be paying much more attention to the Ukrainian experience. And this also goes to the second level, which I'm going to stop here, when it comes to drones, right? Today, Ukraine is a battlefield in which all these technologies are being battle tested. One thing that could work in Nevada desert in ideal conditions may not necessarily operate on the battlefield when actually faced with Russian electronic warfare, the conditions, etc., right? So the experience that Ukraine is developing, both in terms of the innovation, but also the actual learning on how drones are used, is going to be an extremely important part for Canada too, because the Arctic surveillance and knowing what's going on in the Arctic will heavily require both undersea and aerial unmanned vehicles, and that Canada can actually learn a lot on what's going on there, and Canadian companies can actually learn a lot from the battlefield data and etc. So there is a huge set of opportunities. Very lastly, on the political component, and I just want to rephrase again. I don't expect the fundamental contours of Canadian support and relations with Ukraine to change with a conservative government. The people who are the leader, the political leader himself, Pierre Poilievre, as well as the people around him who are advising and focusing on the foreign policy, are solidly pro-Ukrainian. This is not a partisan issue here in Canada, and I think it would be a terrible idea for either party to make support for Ukraine a partisan issue. We know what happens when that happens. That if you just need to look at the United States, you will see the partisan coding of foreign policy in this case is detrimental to the national interest of Canada. So I think I would not, the type of things could change, and I would expect actually a bit more focus on the energy aspect of Canadian support to Ukraine, but the broader contours is not necessarily going to change, and I will stop there.
Can I just chime in on something that Balkan had said earlier? So I think the government we have in Ottawa is very comfortable in issues relating to international law and humanitarian policy. And so it's not surprising that it does those things fairly well. It is not comfortable, however, in issues relating to military policy, or for that matter, natural resources. It's actually terrible when it comes to natural resources. And so when the German chancellor came to Canada, essentially begging for liquefied natural gas, we had none to offer. We have no infrastructure whatsoever. In fact, the government has been pretty clear in not liking those resources. It acts like we're not a resource-rich country. And so the chancellor left with empty pockets and went to Qatar, and the rest is history. So a new conservative government would probably be less comfortable with humanitarian or aid issues more generally, might be less enamored with issues of international law, but it could be a little more comfortable with defense. Now, there could be, of course, willingness to cut further the defense budget, because I think Poilievre is at bottom a libertarian, and the fiscal situation in this country is messy. But certainly the conservative government will be much more active on the resource front. And I think with respect to developing industry to industry ties between Canada and Ukraine, I think that government will be much more forward thinking and much more assertive in that domain.
Alexander, if I can add to this, what you said, what about NATO? Because we de facto have been not talking about the NATO aspect of the bilateral relations, especially with the possible changes in the US administration. And we know that despite the war, the growth for the public opinion support in Ukraine for the NATO integration is just growing. So that would remain one of the ultimate goals of the Ukrainian foreign policy. And here Ukraine needs the more voices inside of the organization, especially considering the US and German positions, where Canada is. Can we consider the more involvement, for example, with the conservative government in assisting Ukraine reaching the goal of not just interoperability, but also the possible joining of the alliance?
So my answer to that question is that I don't think much will change in this regard, in part because Canada's official position is to support Ukraine's NATO membership. And that will not be different under a new conservative government. I suspect it'll be more or less the same. I'm not sure, however, if Canada has the pull to convince Germany to overcome its opposition, or really for that matter, the United States. Indeed, if the United States gets over its hangups, then I think Germany would more or less follow suit, although that is not necessarily given considering what we saw in 2008. But I don't really see any sort of significant policy change in this respect.
I totally agree with Alexander, and basically I don't think Canada has the leverage on this issue. And of course, if Canada sort of try to create some leverage, the allies, rightfully so, would go, well, what was your GDP spending on defense again? So I think we basically don't have much of a leg to stand on to push more than what is being said. I agree that there won't be any change. There will be strong support, but I don't think in the final analysis it will make any difference in terms of pushing Germany or the United States to change their mind. I don't think they will be listening to Canada, especially when we are spending 1.39 on our defense.
Thank you very much. Thanks, our three wonderful speakers. We are finishing today online panel, and it will be available at YouTube and Facebook in recording. And please comment what do you think about the prospects for the Ukraine-Canada bilateral relations. And I hope that in 2025 we would have the new information reasons to discuss the possible upgrade of the Ukraine-Canada relation, that they will not be stuck just in the current stage of the wartime diplomacy, and will receive the new impetus as the relations with other countries as well. Thank you yet one time for our speakers, and hope to see you at the next online panels of the Ukrainian Prism.
Thank you, Anna.